Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
We have a packed schedule this afternoon, so I'll invite you all to get sessile. Get comfortable with the plantness in yourself, your own docility. We have three back-to-back talks this afternoon, and I love that Joella queued them up so beautifully by introducing the concept of phytopoetics and inviting us to consider even the sort of etymological relationship of words like blot to both the leaf and a piece of paper. And this afternoon, we're headed into three conversations that will exclusively explore the way we can think with, read with, write with, speak with plants and fungi. And to begin that series of talks, we're first going to have Jessica J. Lee, who will be introduced by my dear friend, Aaron Scott. Aaron Scott is an award-winning science journalist based in Portland, Oregon. He created the podcast Timber Wars, required listening, hosted NPR's science podcast Shortwave, and is currently finishing the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT. So I'll invite Aaron to the stage. Join me in welcoming him, and we'll hear from Jessica.
Hello, hello, hello. So in the essay Bitter Greens in her newest book, Dispersals, Jessica J. Lee writes, "I was a strange child, with a palate more accustomed to bitterness than sweetness. I would ask my mother to cook me Brussels sprouts, sautéed with butter and shallots and cooking sherry, but rarely wanted desserts." And I would say that we are all so much richer for that bitter palate. In her writing, Jessica reaches out to plants, from brassicas to seaweeds, from cherry trees to soybeans, to encounter them in their own terms, bitterness and all, instead of searching for the sweetness that so often drives the human quest for calories. And in doing so, she unspools the complex global web that entangles us with the plants and fungi we've spent so much time thinking and talking about these past 3 days. Jessica J. Lee is an award-winning British-Canadian Taiwanese writer and environmental historian. She's the author of 3 books of nature writing, Turning, Two Trees Make a Forest, and Dispersals, as well as the children's book, A Garden Called Home. She's the co-editor of the essay collection Dog-Hearted, and I would strongly encourage you to ask her about her dog, and the founding editor of the Willow Herb Review. She has a PhD in environmental history and aesthetics, teaches creative writing at the University of King's College, and lives in Berlin. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Lee.
Ooh, hi. Hold on, I have to get my computer to turn on and give me my notes. There we are. Thank you for that, Erin and Rachel and Charles. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. I am kind of ridiculously honored to be invited to speak among folks who I regard as, I guess, like for want of a better term, rock stars of the plant nerd field. And the book that I believe I've been invited here because of, Dispersals, is hugely indebted to the work of folks like Banu, who I was awed to be able to hear this morning, and whose call for nuanced botanical rememory I hope my work has responded to, and to a number of the authors and thinkers who are in attendance. I'm hugely indebted. So I've been enormously inspired by the level of exchange that's been enabled by these conversations, which brings me to my talk, which, in the spirit of that exchange, I've decided to frame not as an ideas talk. We've had a lot of ideas talks over the past few days, and instead I want to give you a craft talk. So yeah, a few years ago I left work in the History and Philosophy of Science department at Cambridge, first on mat leave because I was having a baby, but then to take up teaching creative writing at the graduate level, and I think this talk is really more about sort of drawing those threads together. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I hope that's okay. Okay, so I want to begin with a bit of a prompt to ask simply if you can recall your earliest memory of a plant or fungi. We can be inclusive and broad here. Perhaps it was a long grass in a garden, you playing amidst it, or perhaps a dandelion plucked between small fingers. Maybe you remember a tree or a houseplant or a flower in a vase. So I want you to just take a quick moment. If you need to close your eyes, that's fine. And just see if you can remember. Yeah, just a quick one. Okay. Very, very quickly, does someone want to just like tell me a name for what their plant was? You don't have to tell me the story, but just the name of a plant. Yeah, right here, Eric? A dandelion, yeah? And in the back with the hat?
The neighbor's black tulips that I picked.
Ooh, okay. Okay, so hold on to these because we're gonna come back to them. Okay, so this is oddly set up. My earliest plant memory, I think, is of my grandfather's bonsai tree. It sat in a shallow rectangular pot on a smoked glass console table in the dining room of his home in Niagara Falls. Now, when I first accessed this memory, I could not tell you what kind of tree it was. I knew only how the light filtered through the lace curtains to leave dappled shadow on its leaves, and that my grandfather tended the tree so carefully, so diligently, with a tiny teapot and these little tiny scissors. And I knew I also was not allowed to touch it. I had the feeling that this tree represented quite a lot. So a few years ago, I asked my mother if she remembered what the tree was. And she suggested it was likely a Fujian tea tree. There's a picture here. My grandfather died 20 years ago, and to this day, I do not know what happened to this bonsai tree. I don't know where it went, but I know that it sits in my mind like a call to remembrance. So today, I want to talk a bit about how we tell more than human stories, and by way of a provocation to all of us as thinkers and writers and scientists and creators, ask how we move forward in doing so, given all we've heard in the past few days and what we have yet to hear. What follows is perhaps less conclusive, but more a series of questions to ask and think and write with. I speak with the caveat that I do so as a nature writer, shaped and perhaps sometimes haunted by scholarly training in the environmental humanities. By the end of my doctorate, I ran away from academia for a time in order to pursue more literary pursuits. But the ghosts of scholarly training are very persistent. And that haunting is perhaps best characterized by my constant curiosity about how to tell plant stories in a way that allows us to move beyond anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, and what is at stake in doing so. How on earth we can begin to tell a story about a plant that isn't simply a story about ourselves. And why bother trying? So the bonsai tree ended up becoming the first entry in a column that I began in 2019 for Catapult magazine, rest in peace, titled Non-Native Species, which would later develop into the basis for dispersals, which I was really excited yesterday to learn. The word disperse comes from the aspergillus, which I will say in the soy chapter, I make use of to make soy sauce. Because I knew so little of this bonsai tree itself, it presented an invitation to research both the specificities of my grandfather's journey with the tree and the wider cultural context in which my grandfather became someone who tended to a bonsai tree. So he was born in China and then moved to Taiwan at the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and then moved to Canada in the 1970s. And he had lived through war with Japan and likewise been part of a wave of Chinese nationalist colonization that followed on the heels of Japanese colonization in Taiwan. So my grandfather's cultivation of the bonsai tree in Canada kind of carried some cultural significance. It was a thread connecting him and my family to a number of particular cultural legacies. But the Fujian tea tree, known to science as Orisha microphylla or Carmona retusa, clearly has stories beyond these personal, familial, and even political, cultural, national scales. So I want to talk a little bit then about methodology. What do we do here? What is possible in our storytelling about plants? And I want to point to some of the ways we might go about it. So at the heart of this talk are three core beliefs. First, that we have an ethical obligation to write with plants, fungi, and even animals, the more than human world, broadly speaking, at the center of our stories. I think for many of us in this audience, this may well be the baseline from which we are all beginning. That's what gets us in this room. This is probably stating the obvious, but I feel we must state it. Second, that we likewise struggle with the impossibility of ontologically accounting for this more than human other. It's difficult to imagine ourselves out of the frame, right? And thirdly, that there is a methodological challenge that presents itself to us as creative practitioners, scholars, or even simply humans in community with others when it comes to doing so. So how do we even begin? I'm going to go through these three. So let's briefly begin with this sort of ethical obligation. I'm struck by the discussions we had on the first day about the need to take planty ways of being seriously, and the talks we've heard both yesterday and this morning that I think point to the very real power dynamics at play here. So what I've got here is a kind of incomplete list of reasons why we might speak of an ethical obligation to recenter plants and fungi in our storytelling, and they're fairly self-explanatory, I think, but for many of us may present both a motivation as well as entry points into the writing itself. So hopefully they're productive points that I'm going to list. So briefly, as we face a crisis of biodiversity and ever-diminishing abundance of life forms on this planet, we heard the term polycrisis the other day, I quite like this, the urgency to examine more than human ways of being in the world becomes escalated. We can say much the same about the climate crisis, not simply because we stand to lose so many species and are losing them every day, but also because an examination that centers plants can likewise force a kind of thinking otherwise, thinking of a world that is not the status quo. Which brings me to the sort of final things I've got on this list. Firstly, that plants have long been mobilized in service of our use. We talked about this morning, whether for agriculture, medicine, industry, or even political and military gain. I refer here to a dominant schema through which more than human life is often treated as extra ethical. That is, with the exception of, say, scholarly environmental ethical work, often beyond the obligations of an ethical relationship. This has been framed variously as, I don't know, an aesthetic relationship, but also an extractive relationship, particularly under dominant forms of, say, Western capitalism, settler colonialism. In this kind of relationship, plants become just another thing to order in a world under human dominion. So we have British nature writer Richard Maybe's explanation of the concept of weeds as plants out of place. As he writes, plants become weeds when they obstruct our plans and our tidy maps of the world. If you have no such plans or maps, they can appear as innocents without stigma or blame. It is this possibility of an unordered or perhaps differently ordered, perhaps non-hierarchical, messy, patchy world that I think especially interesting as a challenge for us to communicate today. Which brings us to an ethical question and perhaps an ontological difficulty. Imagining a world in which we are not the center, but beings in community, beings interpenetrated and co-created by one another. This is, of course, not a unique or a new idea. We've talked about it for days. So we have, for example, the cultural critic Raymond Williams here in 1972 prompting us to ask, what do we mean when we say nature? Right? One touch of nature may make the whole world kin, but usually when we say nature, do we mean to include men or humans? We've spoken the past few days of our ability as practitioners to account for the understandings, agencies, and experiences of the more than human other. And I think this question of co-creation, which we see here in another, I really like Raymond Williams. I should put that front and center. In another quote from Williams, it's really a conundrum for conventional storytelling modes. Williams writes, but once we begin to speak of humans mixing their labor with the earth, we are in a whole world of new relations between men or humans and nature. And to separate natural history from social history becomes extremely problematic. And we saw this, I think, really nicely in Merlin's and Emanuele's talks from Thursday, was it? In Jamie's talk yesterday. This shift requires us to ask in our storytelling, does it make sense to use a language of self and other any longer? Of a single-voiced narrator, first or third person, hero, sole perspective. To pursue linear narrative. Can we find a language beyond subject-object relation? And what would that look like? So what does a story structure look like in this swirling interdependent mode where the world is almost wholly cognizant. If we take this premise seriously, are we talking simply of writing with empathy, an emphasis on affect, or something else entirely? If the past few days of conversation and my own thinking in this talk is anything to go on, perhaps we have no idea, but we muddle through nonetheless, and that is the important task here. Now, all of this, one second. All of this, I hate to say, leaves us with an unfortunately Heideggerian, and as we've been reminded, at its basis Kantian question. Can we even reach towards plants themselves in our writing, or are we simply limited by the linguistic frames we have for tools? This is perhaps most evocatively phrased by Alice Oswald and Jessica Greenman in the opening pages of Weeds and Wildflowers. The plants come right up to the edges of their names and then beyond them. As a writer, this is where I think formal innovation and play are really going to serve us. But many of us are scholars and not simply experimental artists or poets. And as Margaret McFall-Nye has pointed out in her work on microbial constellations, we will need institutional, structural shifts to account for this shifting ontology. A world co-constituted and conscious demands both methodologies and institutional shifts to account for it. So today, I want to speak to methods and some possible paths through this writing. So, like many of you, perhaps, my first brushes with nature writing and environmental writing included the Romantics, Thoreau, Carson, among others. And a dominant sense of the genre as premised on a long naturalist, natural historical tradition, right? A tradition deeply linked to empire and notions of exploration. Enter the explorer dude, you know, it's a big figure here. In short, a framework that could be described here by Mary Louise Pratt, who argues that naturalist revenants remind us that the Anthropocene chronotope leaves humans, modern Occidental humans, at the center of the narrative. So this sort of natural historical trope in nature writing is maybe a first obstacle to work through, work with, reimagine, play with. I would argue that what is exciting about our moment is that we're at a moment where the tradition is actually really engaging with this question and really playing with it. So I don't know if folks remember, like around 2014, 15, all the op-eds being like, nature writing's dead, it's old, it's stale, too white, too conservative. Anyway, here we are, trying something different. But this leaves us with the question of where these existing knowledge forms, right? Scientific knowledges, histories, journeys, maps, all of the things I think on some level we find fun and attractive and enticing. Where do they fit in to this kind of writing, and in what balance? And to what purpose? So in this vein, I want to point to a few examples of contemporary works that inch us towards alternative approaches, whether through content or form. So beginning with this example from Keo McClure's 2023 book, Unearthing. Has anyone here read this book? Seriously? Okay, Keo's Canadian, so maybe that's the obstacle here, but I really, can you all please go read this book? It won the Governor General's Literary Award in Canada. It's a big deal. It's a really excellent book. Okay, so from Unearthing, I want to stress that this is a memoir and not a wholesale reimagining of plant cognition or hierarchies. That's not what she's doing. But it does offer a really nice framework for thinking through some of the strands that might be relevant in the task of sort of recentering plants. So she writes, fragile groupings. Perhaps that is what we are. 8 unrelated organisms briefly entwined, positing tiny plant joy as proof of a wakeful turning earth against the global roar of fascism, apocalyptic news of floods and storms and imminent ecological collapse. She's speaking here of a short residency she did with other humans, looking at plant knowledges. And I think this quote gives us some sense of the ways in which we need to be able to hold many strands at once in our storytelling, to consider plant stories at multiple scales, and to consider grouping, community, many-voicedness as a narrative possibility. So as a brief side shoot to this, I added this paragraph the other day after a discussion, so this paragraph will feel out of place. But as a side shoot to this, I took part last year in a collective nature writing project with colleagues Elisa Pir Mohammed, Nina Minya-Poles, and Pratyusha under the shared banner of Field Notes Collective, that's what we call ourselves, attempting to experiment with collaborative narrative, collaborative nature writing as a way of exploring this many-voicedness. And so for that, we produced a co-authored work. I have a few of them here, which we then published through the small press Bitter Melon, which Nina runs. So it was also this really beautiful act of reclaiming our labor, because as writers who work in commercial publishing and in that space, we don't get to make our books physically, but these ones are hand-stitched by us. So if anyone wants to come talk about this aspect more, about method, or to see an example, we can talk about it in the questions. You can come see me later. But coming back to what McClear frames as fragile groupings, she also tells us that metaphor is a way of making family out of seemingly unrelated things. So we have one more possibility for how we might tell these stories. The persistent, haunting spirit of this conference, metaphor. Metaphors aren't straightforward. We know this, as Rachel and Merlin and Ernesto and every single one of us have reminded us on the first day and ongoing. And as biologist Andreas Haenel has reminded us, metaphors are always a double bind. They at once allow us to see and stop up our abilities to notice. But I will say he also concludes, we need many metaphors, rhizomes and corals as well as bushy, gnarly trees. And this is something I want us to hold on to. Let's not throw them away. We have these borrowed images from the more than human world, rhizomes, webs, mycelium, ecosystem. But what does that look like on the page? So I teach creative writing on an MFA program, and probably the most asked thing from my students is how we are meant to structure a creative work, or even a scholarly one. And I often give a probably really maddening reply while giving my students a giant roll of craft paper and a pad of Post-it notes and some Crayola markers, which is to ask, what does your subject want to be on the page? Tangentially, I want to call particular attention to the fact that I've said subject and the term subject matter, and the curious fact that we do not speak of object matter. And if long attention to a subject is a mode of narrative recentering, it is the subject who enacts action in a sentence. So what shape does our subject want to be on the page? We've already got fantastic examples to run with. Jane Allison's craft book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, is a look at narrative structure in fiction that I think is actually more useful to nonfiction and especially useful to those of us in environmental pursuits. Those of us writing the more than human, in that she appeals explicitly to forms borrowed from the more than human world. So we have the conventional arc, right? Or wave, sure. But likewise, we can have stories that are spirals, meanders, fractals, cells, or explosions. We may also consider structures like lists, marginalia, notes, or qualifications, and where that comes in on the page. Anything that can help us break with the sort of subject-object hierarchy, linearity of the conventional page. And we've seen this a long time ago, really wonderfully, in Anna Singh's Friction, for example, where she uses notes in the margin to add whole ecosystems back into the narrative, right? To add qualifications and explanations. Here, the world becomes incrementally less linear, more constellated. I want to ask us as writers, as scientists and communicators, to learn to play. To literally or metaphorically draw, sing, dance, sculpt our work into a shape that feels representative of the story we are trying to tell. Can we allow ourselves that permission and that joy? And where simple metaphor fails us, I argue in favor of multiple angles of approach. That is, the plant story as weave, as braid, as fragment, as graft, and as gap. So I've got two examples here, one taken from Dispersals, and the other from British Kenyan poet Elizabeth Jane Burnett's book, 12 Words for Moss. I feel like, Elaine, this one is like for you. I wanted to pull these together because actually we're both writing here about the same species, heath star moss, which is considered in Europe and North America to be a significant invasive, to borrow the unhappy language of invasion ecologies, but presents us with a challenge in thinking otherwise. This is a species that is really widespread now, and it does have negative impacts on coastal dune plant communities. And because it is a moss and therefore very small, spreading by spore and clonal reproduction, is now presumed by many to be impossible to eradicate. This is a story I trace perhaps more straightforward, in perhaps more straightforward terms in my work as a braided narrative looking at the plant's biological history, movement, range, and our human perceptions of it as invasive, as passenger, as agent, alongside my personal connection to it, concluding that it is a plant that demands us to think at a scale to which we are unaccustomed. I point to the gaps in our understanding, and somehow in gathering many strands together, hope to get us just that little bit closer to the moss. So I write, more than any I have encountered, this is a species whose movements cannot be held at bay. To do so would require us to think and act beyond a scale to which we are accustomed. We do not know how to live at the scale of a moss fragment, let alone a spore. How then can we learn to live with the heath star moss? But sitting my take alongside Burnett's is where I think we can have the more fruitful conversation, because she writes of encounters with this moss in prose as well, but she inserts into each of her chapters these poetic interludes. And these reach for something, I think, of the gap in how we account for this moss's existence in our world. And this, to me, is reaching towards the ontological difficulty, that bit we fail to account for when we attempt to pin a plant down. So I suppose what I'm saying is, hybrid forms, prose poetry, fragments, gaps, all of this can help us in our reaching. So she writes, and I will note two things. One, that it is called Merlin, and two, that this poem can be read in different directions. Sea, hill, soil, hair, hoar leaf, swell, swear, an oath in a fertile pocket, call it a spell or a longing, an inflorescent promise, call it a debt or a song, gathered in violets and torn, in a language hidden, from fretted rhizoids born, from sight, call it birthright, in trailing burst of low stars, in bubbling undercurrent, where the milk tooth flowers, its trembling powers. Which brings me to the one real thought I have in terms of a potential method, which is really how I frame all of the essays in Dispersals, and that is as a reaching towards as method. Where we cannot account for the plant or fungal mind as it is in the world, I propose we get ourselves as close as damn possible, as simultaneously and in close proximity as possible. I'm thinking here of Liz's reflection the other day on how many students in the classroom will come up with many accounts for a scientific question. Here, we must be many tendrilled in our reaching. We tell the human stories that are only possible because of these plants, yes, and we tell the scientific ones that try to strip back that humanness, and the ones that bring the humanness back in, and the silenced stories, and the conjectural imagined ones, and we look for the overlaps. We tell as many stories as possible in a single space, in a single work even, on a single page, because somewhere in the gap between them, we might find ourselves getting that little bit closer. We must reach towards the thing itself, and that is the best we can do. Perhaps that is an ambivalent conclusion. I want to read this passage from the note to the reader before we start to close. This precedes the book itself, Dispersals. It's from the opening pages. When I was a child, my paternal grandmother had a painted window hanging of a European robin, and beneath it sat a sun catcher. When the light shone through it, it refracted into beams of color that danced upon the kitchen walls. The essays in this collection are rather like that. In each, plants illuminate facets of life and our world, whether personal, political, ecological, scientific, or otherwise. The plants here are displaced in a range of ways. Some are seen as weeds hitching a ride around the globe. Some are valuable human crops, humans have intentionally extracted from one place to another, while others are cultural artifacts of human stewardship or technoscientific plant breeding. These stories are but a fraction of their being in the world. As I wrote, I came to see more clearly that the trees, shrubs, grasses, mosses, algae, and seeds in this book are forces of their own, making worlds far beyond my imagination and interpretation. Our pictures of the world are only ever fragmentary, and our language for plants is much the same. In this talk and in Dispersals, and I think this conference as a whole, where we all come from so many different traditions of writing and storytelling, what I mean, and I hope we mean to ask for, is a storytelling of plurality rather than sole truths, stories instead of story, getting comfortable with writing where we cannot be definitive, where we cannot force arguments or conclusions, and where formal innovation can help reflect our messy living reality. So with that in mind, to close, I want to ask you again, what is your earliest plant memory? And how would you tell a story of this plant? Thank you for the stop sign. I'm going to finish now. I wasn't planning to conclude with this originally, but I think you might enjoy it. I'm hoping you might enjoy it. I want us to close with a very short creative writing exercise. Will you entertain me that? Okay. Does everyone have something they can write with it? You can do it on a phone. It's very straightforward. Okay. So I'm going to talk you through the task. It's a prompt I use really often in my teaching, and normally I call it object lessons, but today we're going to call it plant lessons. So first I want you to remember your plant that we brought into the room at the beginning of this conversation. You're going to make 3 short lists. That's the task, okay? It's a beginning task that you can then take to move on to more sustained writing later in whatever form you prefer. The first is a sensory list. I want you to imagine you are holding or touching this plant and exploring it with your senses. Don't do it yet. I'll talk you through it. You're going to write down a word or a phrase for each sense that is sparked by this plant, right? However loosely related, don't censor yourself. The second list is an entanglements list. I call it a commitments list. What are this plant's commitments? Personal, political, economic, ecological, right? What wider ideas or forces is this plant entangled with? I want you to list as many as you can, right? And the last list you'll make is about connections and community. So I want you to make a list of everyone for whom this plant matters. Doesn't have to be a human list. It can be very broad. Who made it? Who grew it? Who planted it? Who owns it? Who misses it? I like, think in the long time scale, before and after. Does the plant that decomposes matter for the microbes in the soil, right? They go on the list. So let's quickly go through these 3 items. We'll start, and I'll tell you when to move on to the next thing, okay? So we're going to do the first part, the senses. Go. In the interest of time, we'll do the next part. So you're listing some commitments now, entanglements, embranglements. And your last one, who does this matter for? So perhaps you're going to want to continue working on this list after you leave here, but I'm going to stop here and just thank you for letting me speak.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.